This conference will now be recorded.
Tonight I'm going to tell you the story of the Transcontinental Railroad, and in particular, a bunch of powerful men, a fair amount of greed, and a lot of perseverance. The first Transcontinental Railroad was 1,777 miles in length. The Union Pacific actually built quite a bit more than the Central Pacific, primarily because the Central Pacific had to go through the Sierra Mountains, and their progress through those mountains was very slow. Later on, the spur was added from Sacramento to San Francisco. Started in Council Bluff, Iowa. My primary source for this was Stephen Ambrose's book, Nothing Like It in the World. It's a very good book. It's an account of unprecedented engineering vision and courage, and you have to think about when it was done. The story of the men who built the Transcontinental Railroad. Some of them were investors, some of them were politicians, many of them were engineers and surveyors, and then sometimes hardworking individual people, some of whom lost their lives. It's also the story of Irish and Chinese immigrants and defeated Confederate soldiers. That's who filled the ranks of the Union Pacific later on. And then the other laborers who did the backbreaking work on the tracks. I'm going to give you a 5,000-foot high view of the project. I'm not going to pretend that you're going to come away from it fully understanding all of the details, but I hope what you get is a pretty strong impression of what went into that project. Hot Dog Owen is here, and he can keep me from going too far off the rails, right, Owen? Early railroads in the United States. In 1825, an American named John Stevens built the first test track with a locomotive around his summer home estate. That was the first railroad, and I believe it was around Baltimore. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the first commercial railroad in the United States, was built in 1827. In 1831, the DeWitt Clinton locomotive was built at the West Point Foundry in New York. They made its first test run in 1831. So railroads were relatively new by the time this story unfolds. But American railroads were on their way. And you can see how over time, rails initially were built mostly along the eastern seaboard, but by 1850, a fair amount had actually come inland and were starting to be built, especially in the Midwest. It blossomed in 1850 to 1860. By the advent of the Civil War, that's what the rail structure looked like. Interestingly, look where Chattanooga is. It is probably one of the 2 or 3 most important rail junctures in the South. And by then, what had happened was mill owners up in New England launched the Boston and Lowell Railroad to parallel the Middlesex Canal. Up until then, up until even into 1850, canals were still a primary means of moving goods and freight. But this was the first attack of rail companies against canal interests specifically. And over the next few years, railroads replaced canals as the first choice of transportation infrastructure. And you can see what that looked like by 1860. Now, I want you to look at this picture for just a second and look at where it all stops. It all stops at the Mississippi River. I'm going to talk a little bit about why that was true. There were a few places where rails could get across the Mississippi, but not very many. Now, preliminary surveys. Beginning in the 1840s, government expeditions were looking for potential railroad routes across the West. They had not even really crossed the Mississippi, but they were already looking westward as far as what would be the potential railroad route. There was no consensus about that route, primarily because different areas of the country had different agendas. In 1853, Jefferson Davis, who at the time was Secretary of War, commissioned a group of surveys. They lasted 2 years, and they were carried out on a very broad scale by something that at the time was fairly new called a topographical organization that was part of the Corps of Engineers. 4 routes were evaluated: a northern route, a central route, and 2 southern routes. They produced a 10-volume study that covered 400,000 square miles of the American West. And if you can go back a little bit to the talk about manifest destiny, they were already thinking in terms of the West Coast by 1853 and everything in between. But there was no agreement about which route to choose. Different groups of people, in particular, people who were supporting slavery and people who were anti-slavery, were very much at odds about how to go about getting across the United States. I want to talk a little bit about California. In 1821, California became Mexican. That's when the Mexican War of Independence took place. Up until then, California was Spanish. That began Mexican rule in California, 1821. In 1836, by now there were American and other European immigrants in California, and Graham led a coup against the Mexican governor of Northern California. It did not work, and he was imprisoned. So by 1836, and remember that date, that's the date that Texas proclaimed independence from Mexico. In 1846, Americans in California declared an independent California Republic. By now, American settlers were filtering into the region. The Mexican War took place in the late 1840s. At the end of that, California, among other things, was transferred to the United States in 1848. Following the gold rush in 1849, there were 120,000 Americans in the California. That's when it became a state. 12 years later, there were 380,000 people in California. That's the effect of both the gold rush and a number of other features about California. It was a fertile land with many prospects. It was a lucrative target for the growth of the United States. Sidebar, Jerry Pala in style. I don't know how many of you know about the Donner Party. In early 1846, a group of 90 immigrants, including 31 members of 2 specific families, the Donner family and the Reed family, they left Springfield, Illinois, heading west. They were going to take a new and shorter route to California. And along the way, they encountered a number of delays. And because of those delays, they did not get to the Sierras when they wanted to be there. By the time they got into the Sierras themselves, they were trapped by heavy snowfall. They were about, to specifically identify where they were about 30 miles northwest of Lake Tahoe. They were trapped, and they were trapped for the entire winter. They were reduced to cannibalism to survive throughout the winter. And only half of the original group reached California in 1847. The story spread, and before long, the term Donner Party became synonymous with disaster. But we're going to come back to the Donner Pass later on. The route was through what became known as the Donner Pass. It became the heart of the successful route of the Canadian Pacific Railroad. The Sacramento Valley Railroad was the first railroad for transit. There were railroads, small spurs that were used in the mining region and in other areas, but it was the first transit railroad company incorporated in California. The first train operated there in 1856. It was the forerunner to the Central Pacific Railroad. This man, who I didn't even know about, is really considered the father of the Transcontinental Railroad. His name is Theodore Judah. He was a civil engineer. You might notice up above how short his life was. He died when he was 38 years old, but he was central to the establishment and the design of the first Transcontinental Railroad. In 1854, he became chief engineer to the Sacramento Valley Railroad, the one I just spoke of. In 1857, he was in Washington, D.C., and he published something called a practical plan for building the Pacific Railroad. It was the general plan for the Transcontinental Railroad. In it, he recommended a detailed survey of a route for the railroad. So at the time, it was still just an idea. There was no one who was sure that they knew how to do it. He started seeking investors for the Central Pacific Railroad. In addition to everything else that he was doing, and the investors were raising money, he was a secretary to the Congressional Committee for the Pacific Railroad in the United States government. So he was going back and forth from California to Washington, politicking with Congress to fund the railroad in the late 1850s. He became the chief engineer of the Central Pacific Railroad. He personally completed the survey work to determine the route over the Sierra Nevadas. He died of yellow fever in 1863. He contracted the disease. Harken back to the story about the Panama Canal. He contracted the disease in Panama on a trip back east. Now, who was the Central Pacific Railroad? It was formed by 5 people. Theodore Judah approached 4 Sacramento businessmen. Some of these names you might know, some of them you might not. Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Charles Crocker, and Mark Hopkins. Getting them to put money into this project required a fair amount of encouragement, a fair amount of gamesmanship, promising them that the potential was absolutely well beyond anything that they might invest. Following the completion of the railroad surveys in 1855, this national proposal to build the Transcontinental Railroad failed because of political disputes over slavery. In 1855, members of Congress from the South would not support this railroad because it was going through non-slave states, and the proposal that they favored was what is called the Southern route, and that's the one that the slave-owning politicians would support. With the secession of the South in 1861, the Republican Party now controlled the U.S. Congress. They passed legislation almost as soon as the war began, authorizing the Central Rail Route, and the way they were going to finance it was land grants and government railroad bonds. The bonds would be repaid with interest. The land grants, and I'm going to speak some more later on about how much land we're talking an immense amount of land, was the long-term incentive to these railroad magnates. The Canadian Pacific Railroad, the Central Pacific Railroad was chartered by the Congress in 1862 to build a railroad eastward from Sacramento. That was the western leg. I'll go back to the first slide. The western leg of the first Transcontinental Railroad. And these are the four men plus Judah who were at the heart of it. Another sidebar, another Jerry Palla. While we're talking about this particular area, I thought it might be interesting to talk about the Pony Express. The gold rush, the Mormon exodus, and the thousands who were moving west on the Oregon Trail created a demand for communications. The demand was partially filled by something called the Butterfield Overland Mail Service, which started in 1857, and other private carriers. 1,800 miles in 10 days. The Pony Express went from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California, delivered mail faster than ever before. If you were a Pony Express rider, you were paid $50 a month. And I'm not sure how many legs you were expected to ride in that month, but it was quite a few. It only operated for 18 months, from April of 1860 to October of 1861. But it was the symbol that a lot of people relate to as the Old West. It was not eliminated because of the Transcontinental Railroad. It was eliminated because of the Transcontinental Telegraph Line, which was built in 1861. That ended the usefulness of the Pony Express. I'm sure it was very expensive to operate. You might want to know a little bit about Abraham Lincoln and the railroad. As a lawyer in his middle years, much of his living was made with railroad cases. Lincoln was considered the railroad lawyer. He was a central figure in something called the Rock Island Bridge case. That case established the right of railroads to cross navigable waterways. And what happened was there was a railroad bridge across the Mississippi. A boat ran into the bridge. The suit was about their navigability, or the lack of navigability caused by the bridge. Eventually, the suit was found to be baseless, and that removed the impediments of railroads' expansions west of the Mississippi River. He personally loaned money to a friend, and he used land, and this friend used land for collateral in Council Bluffs, Iowa. He went to Council Bluff in 1859, I believe, and he talked to this man named Grenville Dodge, who was a railroad man. And he asked Dodge, which route is the railroad going to take? Dodge told him it's going to come through Council Bluff. As a result, Abe decided to loan money to this friend using that land for collateral. He never got the land, but he got his money back a few years later. He became convinced that that middle route was going to be the route that would be chosen, even though at the time they were still arguing in Congress with the slave owners who wanted the southern route. Despite the Civil War, he was a firm supporter of the bill in 1862. I mean, that's right after Bull Run. That bill authorized the project. He wanted the project to start as soon as possible. Just a little bit about the acts themselves. The Pacific Railroad Act of 1862. It authorized the building of a transcontinental railroad in the United States using government bonds and grants of land. And here's how much land they got. They got 6,400 acres per mile of track. That's what the land grant looked like in 1862. The act was signed by Lincoln July the 1st, 1862, funded by those grants and bonds. The bonds were to pay 6% to the Union Pacific Railroad and the Central Pacific Railroad companies. The railroad was going to start at Council Bluff and end at the navigable waters of the Sacramento River. In 1863, just 1 year later, what they found out was that the original offer in terms of land in particular was not sufficient to encourage enough people to put their money into it. In 1863-64, there were further acts by Congress. Now there was a lot of graft changing hands by then. I'll get back to the graft a little bit later in the program. But among other things, they established the gauge of the railroad at 4 feet, 8.5 inches. They permitted the railroads to issue their own bonds. And that's going to matter also. They also gave the railroads mineral rights to that acreage that they were given and doubled the size of the land grant. So the land grant is now 12,800 acres per mile of rail. A further amendment in 1865 authorized an extension from Sacramento to San Francisco. In total, they authorized $110 million for the building of the railroad, plus the land grants. And if you go back to almost 2,000 miles of track, we're talking something on the order of 2 million acres of land. Quite a bit. Tell you a little bit about the Union Pacific Railroad. It was incorporated as soon as the law was passed by Congress. A board of directors was formed by Congress with 167 members on it. Half of them didn't even participate. Their initial funding efforts, now I'm back to why the first act had to be amended so soon, were a failure. Among other things, the law required that no partner could own more than 10% of the stock, and the Union Pacific had problems selling its stock. One of the few subscribers was the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, Brigham Young. He eventually supplied crews to both railroads for building the railroads through Utah. a man named Thomas Durant emerged as the leader of a consortium. And what he did was he enticed other investors by fronting the money for them for the stock they purchased in their names. That let him control about half of the railroad stock in direct contravention to what the act itself stated. Initially, there was very little construction by the Union Pacific, and it actually traversed land that was already owned by Durant. To inflate its profits, they built oxbows of unneeded track. And I don't know how many of you know what an oxbow is. An oxbow is when you it's a loop in a river that gets cut off by a flood. Think in terms of loops instead of going from one point to the other by direction. By 1865, it had only reached 40 miles from Omaha after 2.5 years of construction. Talk a little bit about Thomas Durant. He was a doctor, a medical doctor. He was also a businessman and a financier. He was a railroad builder in the Midwest. After the Congress created the Union Pacific, he assumed the role of management of the Union Pacific and also money raising. He organized and at first controlled an organization called the Credit Mobilier of America. I'll give you a specific discussion about the Credit Mobilier later on in the talk. But in 1867, he lost control of the company to a group called the Ames Brothers. He was the vice president of the Union Pacific in 1869 when it met the Central Pacific at Promontory Point in Utah. Grenville Dodge, remember the man that met Lincoln back in Council Bluff? He became a general in the Union Army. In fact, after the war was over, he continued in the Army and he was serving under both Grant and Sherman, fighting the Native Americans who were a big problem for the railroad. However, in 1866, he resigned with the endorsement of both Grant and Sherman, and he became the Union Pacific's chief engineer. His job or his role was to plan the route and also to devise solutions for any obstacles that were encountered. Grenville Dodge was a very important person in the operation of the Union Pacific. Getting started. Now we're back out west. As soon as they were authorized, Judah now was back east. He purchased 8 locomotives, 5,000 tons of rail and passenger and rail cars. And they had to be shipped to the West Coast. And here you see one of the serious shortcomings of starting from the West Coast. Everything that they had to operate with had to be shipped. This is before the Panama Canal, around the Cape of South America. Collis Huntington, one of the what they call the Big Four, he was also back east. He was arranging financing and he was also purchasing more rolling stock. So they were immediately starting to spend money in 1862 as soon as they were authorized. Charles Crocker, another member of the Big Four, formed a construction company. That was formed to build the railroad. And certainly early on, construction was the profit center. Because they felt that Crocker, also being the construction manager, had a conflict of interest, he had to resign from the board of directors of the Central Pacific. That should be CP. The CP board fragmented over economic issues. The Big Four did not like Judah, and they tried to squeeze him out. They had very different ideas about where priorities should be, how to spend their resources, what kinds of direction to take. Judah planned to find new directors and funding. Actually, one of his connections back east was someone he was going to go back and see on the trip that he died on. Governor, now one of the Big Four, Leland Stanford, was governor of the state of California. He prodded the state legislature to issue bonds of $10,000 per mile of track in return for free shipping considerations. So Leland Stanford made arrangements with the state of California to participate in the funding of the railroad. First rails were actually laid in 1863. Governor Stanford gave the keynote speech. Construction really started in earnest in 1865. The biggest problem that the Central Pacific encountered was crossing the Sierras. Their task was more difficult than the one of the Union Pacific. And if you went back to the very early part of it, the Union Pacific built about 10 miles for every 6 miles that the Central Pacific was able to build. However, Judah was convinced that the Sierras could be crossed, and today the route that he chose remains in use. And this is what it looks like up in the Sierras, trying to get through some of the problems that they encountered. He was handicapped, now Judah, by not having survey maps. So he created them. He surveyed the route through the Sierras personally. The only natural passageway through the Sierras was the Donner Pass. Its elevation was 7,000 feet. Judah chose it. In the construction of the Central Pacific, a total of 15 tunnels had to be blasted in the Sierras. The tunnels were variable in length. The longest one was 1,700 feet through a portion of the mountain. Now, tunnels, thought you might be interested in it. Initially, they relied on men with hammers and chisels. They made holes in this, and this is granite, into which blasting powder was packed at first. The California Powderworks factory was built near Santa Cruz specifically to support the efforts of the Central Pacific. It had 275 Chinese workers, and it produced 1,800 tons of powder per year. During the winter of 86, 87, 8,000 men were working on these tunnels in 3 round-the-clock shifts. In one case, and I don't know how they did this, the workers were actually attacking from 4 different directions. They would drill inward from the ends and outward from the center. And it didn't explain how they got to the center. You can only guess. When black powder was replaced with nitroglycerin, the pace of excavation increased from 1.18 to 1.82 feet per day. That's the rate of progress of these tunnels. They were very, very labor intensive and dangerous and slow. Now, you could not transport nitroglycerin because of its volatility or its sensitivity. So it had to be produced on site. The Central Pacific had a nitroglycerin manufacturing facility at the site where they took glycerin, nitrate, and sulfuric acids and converted them into nitro on a daily basis. Nitroglycerin was fragile and dangerous until Alfred Nobel invented dynamite in 1866. Once dynamite had been invented, they no longer had to manufacture the nitroglycerin at the site. Who worked on the railroad? There were very few mechanical devices available. So grading, tunneling, fills, and bridges all had to be built by hand. The Central Pacific could not find a workforce. People preferred working in the mines, the gold mines, working anywhere to working on the railroad. They decided to use Chinese laborers. And there was a great deal of discussion about that because people didn't think that the Chinese would work very hard. So they started with a small crew, tested its productivity. Eventually, there were more than 12,000 Chinese laborers working on the Central Pacific. Many of the Union Pacific laborers were initially Irish immigrants. And after the Civil War ended, there were numerous veterans available. They were willing to work for $2 to $3 a day. Fatalities on the railroad were between 1,500 and 2,500. And I suspect that if I had access to a lot more information than is readily available on the internet, I could get a better number than that, but good records don't exist. In particular, I don't think they kept very good records about the Chinese immigrants who were killed. Laying out the route. Both companies used a similar approach to establishing the route. First, there was a survey that would be called a general route. It was constrained by elevation restrictions and curvature restrictions, but it was still a general route. The second survey group produced a more general center line, but it had a lot of room for variation. The third survey then was the detailed one. It had a center line. It showed cuts and fills for construction to follow. Although the Central Pacific had to go over the Sierras, the Union Pacific also had some demanding terrain. They had to go over quite a few rivers, through swamps, and in particular, they had a problem with timber resources. There was only one kind of wood readily available to the Union Pacific, cottonwood. Cottonwood does not make good material for a railroad. Construction challenges. Thought you would be interested in this. If you look to the right, you see something called a snow shed. The snow sheds had to be built because of avalanches during the winter. Picture to the left is that's a look at what the terrain looked like in the Sierras. Picture at the bottom left is something called a Chinese wall. So they came out of a snow shed in order to maintain a level going straight ahead. They built this hand-placed wall. And then finally, the problems that they had to face were Native Americans. They were threatened by the white man and his iron horse, and they were wise to have been threatened. However, many UP, Union Pacific workers, remember Irish, remember Civil War veterans, entertained themselves with alcohol and gambling, and there were perennial problems with the UP that the Central Pacific did not have. The Chinese workers were not problems. However, the Central Pacific had much more dangerous work, and so they struggled to keep anybody other than the Chinese. Another of the problems that happened in the Sierras was the weather. It would snow heavily. They continued to work throughout the winter. They faced that 7,000-foot summit and tunnels through the mountain, blasting extensively. So the construction of this railroad, and by the way, the construction on this railroad was more demanding than the construction would have been on the southern route. However, as I said before, the southern route was considered unacceptable because of its connotation of slavery. Trestles and bridges, thought you might be interested in this. In 1860, the bridge designs that were sitting around would not support the loads concentrated over the axles of a train. They weren't flexible enough. They were not able to traverse acute curves and changes in grade. So there had to be a lot of new bridge design to support this project. Trestles hugged steep cliffs through the Donner Pass. One of the trestles was 1,100 feet long. And if you're interested, do you know the difference between a trestle and a bridge? A bridge crosses a gap usually that has water over it, whereas a trestle is supported on both ends. And really, all bridges are trestles, but not all trestles are bridges. The Truss Bridge was reinvented. In particular, what they started doing was using iron to supplement the wood. It was constantly being improved upon, from the design of the bridge itself to the design of its separate members. They first built temporary wooden trestles and bridges, and then they later replaced them with more durable iron structures. I could not find anywhere the total number of bridges that were built. I would imagine it was a whole lot more than the 15 tunnels that were built. Finally, the Credit Mobilier. This is a picture of a man named Oakes Ames. He was a House of Representative member from Massachusetts. It was illegal manipulation of contracts by the construction company associated with the building of the Union Pacific. Its operations were actually typical of 19th century railroad building. It was a wide open period, often referred to as the Great Barbecue. The Credit Mobilier was created by the Union Pacific executives to inflate construction costs. Here's how they did it. Actual costs of the Union Pacific were $50 million, but they billed $94 million and were paid that amount by the federal government. The other $50 million was pure profit. However, part of the cash and some discounted stock was used to bribe Washington politicians in order to get their support for laws, funding, and regulatory rulings. When this all came to light, there was a congressional inquiry, but nothing was proven. With only a few congressional censures, the matter was dropped. It wasn't quite business as usual, but it was not considered to be a big deal. The Golden Spike. As closure neared, Charles Crocker bet Thomas Durant that his crews could lay 10 miles of track in one day. And if you read about how they did that, it was really impressive. And they did it. Durant did not pay up. The railroads met at Promontory Point in Utah, and that is a point that was fixed by Congress for the meeting. It's actually no longer on the railroad line. It's off the line. Photos were taken with the Central Pacific's Jupiter and the Union Pacific number 119 facing coupler to coupler. Now what they had was they had a golden spike to join the last rail. Both of the principals failed to hit the spike. whether or not they had been drinking too much the night before or other kinds of weren't working kind of people anyway, they failed to hit the spike. So a railroad worker actually drove the final spike at 12:47, May 10th, 1869. Conclusions. The Transcontinental Railroad owes its success to a small number of men, some more praiseworthy than others. There is little doubt that the effort was rife with fraud. 12 years later, earlier I talked about the Southern route. The Southern Pacific Railroad completed the second Transcontinental Railroad in America with ceremonies in 1883. Interestingly, the Big Four, who were the heart and soul of the Central Pacific, were also the heart and soul of the Southern Pacific on the western end. The Southern Pacific Railroad encountered tremendous legal and political problems. In 1885, the Canadian Transcontinental Railroad was built with far less fanfare. And then last, the Panama Canal and the Manhattan projects were the last major federally funded mega projects until the interstate highway system. And I wonder if we have any volunteers who would like to tell us more of the details about the interstate highway. And with that, I'm open to questions.
Hey, George.
Hey, Jerry.
Wasn't it a fact that the bridge over the Missouri River wasn't built until, what, 3 or 4 years after the railroad was completed? And didn't they have to ferry goods across the Missouri River for those 3 or 4 years?
I don't know when that bridge was built. You're talking about the one at Council Bluffs?
Between Council Bluffs and Omaha.
I'm not sure when that was built, Jerry. You might be right. It certainly wasn't there when they started.
Yeah, but it really didn't become a transcontinental until that bridge was finished. And I think it was like 1872 or 3 or something like that.
You might be right. I did not know that.
Also, do you know what the difference in the cost of the Southern Pacific versus the first transcontinental?
I really looked hard and couldn't find anything about how they funded the Southern Pacific. I was looking, among other things, to find out what kind of land grants they got, and I'm sure they got them, but I couldn't find out what they were. Yeah. It's like the first railroad, the one that I talked about tonight, gets all the press, gets all the history books. The information that's on the Southern Pacific is much, much more confusing. I could not find any information about how they funded it. I did find out that it had a lot of lawsuits. It had a much more complicated it didn't have just 2 railroads reaching to each other. It had a number of different groups of people who were involved, and they didn't get along real well. But I could not find how much it cost to build the Southern.
And do you know, after it was completed, was it making money? Did it, was it a profitable venture afterward?
Well, the profit in terms of, did they get their $110 million back in terms of?
No, I mean,
because they were bonds.
The Union Pacific, once they ran, didn't they have some financial difficulties later in the 1890s? Or
their financial difficulties came about because of the credit mobilier.
Yeah,
they owed the government $50 million, and how that got worked out, I couldn't find either.
Yeah,
George, I know the federal government issued 30-year bonds, but I can recall that some of the railroads had issued 100-year bonds, and some of those never did pay off.
That's possible. Remember, I said that in California, Leland Stanford got the government of California to issue bonds, and I don't know how they did. I didn't really dig into the finances that much, I went with what I had in the way of information, and it's not something that, unless you want to read a fair number of history books, that you're going to find very much good information on the internet about.
Hey, George, about 3 years ago, there was a TV series that people might enjoy if they want to look it up, called Hell on Wheels. And it basically is focused on the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad across the United States. And it's led by a chief engineer who is a former Union soldier, Union officer. Anyway, it's a great series if somebody wants to watch it. You can find it.
Never heard of it, Fred.
Hell on Wheels.
Okay, got it.
It seems to me that's how the coin Hell on Wheels got started, in that, particularly with the Irish, it was like a moving saloon where they knew when payday was coming for those workers, and so they had basically a moving saloon with its own brothel to help fund the activities of all these guys, and that's how the coin of Hell on Wheels got started, as best I remember from the book.
Okay,
Oh, that's a good story.
it is a good story.
Well, George, thank you very much. That was very enlightening.
Yeah,
Thank you, George.
good
You're welcome.
program.
What's
Excellent
next?
See you
presentation.
guys tomorrow morning.
Gary, what's next?
Next week, I'm going to do a little local history.
Oh,
I'm going to
good.
do a program on the trial of the century
Which one is that?
in Dayton, Tennessee, the Scopes trial.
Okay, okay. Good old swamp.
Very interesting. I'm going to tell you everything you didn't know.
Okay.
So,
Well, I enjoyed it, guys. I hope you didn't hear anything from Owen. Owen, I didn't at all.